Hi there. Thanks for joining us today on Wolfer Live. I'm Robin Wilson, and I'm joined today by fellow Wolfer, Laura Zam. Um, you could see that Laura has a new book out. I think it launches next week. She got the entire box of books delivered to her house last week or this week, and so she's ready to go.
Yeah,
Yeah, so thanks for joining us, Laura.
I'm so happy to be here, and thank you, Robin. It's so great to see you and to spend this hour together.
I agree. Yes. So I've read Laura's book, obviously, and it takes readers on really a long journey that Laura started to look for the source of her sexual dysfunction. I would call it sexual pain, low libido. You know, in her mid 40s, she was married for the first time and decided it was time to figure things out. And so she visited probably a few dozen or a couple dozen at least practitioners, from, you know, a gynecologist to physical therapist to psychotherapist to sexologist to something called a tantrika, which she'll tell us about. But you know, the thing, before we do that, I think that humans think that sexual pleasure comes naturally to people, and that we don't really need to wonder or worry or work hard at it. But in fact, reading your book and talking to you, I feel like it's something that maybe isn't natural for many women. So maybe we could talk about that.
Yeah, so it's not, it is natural, obviously, right? But it's very, it's unclear, I think, I mean, reproduction is a natural process, but
Yes.
pleasure for women is not necessarily an obvious process. It's
Mm-hmm.
natural in terms of the body is built for it, but it's not necessarily something that we know how to access. And sex education is so lacking, so completely lacking,
Mm-hmm.
it, not just in this country, but all over the world. But just I can speak for my own education, and I know that this is common for many, many, many women. I learned about reproduction in health class when I was in
Sure.
seventh grade, and I have a little bit of a scene of that in my book. But I did not learn that there was a clitoris. I did not know until I started my healing journey that the clitoris is both the external part, the little button, but there's also a whole internal part. I had none of this information.
Mm-hmm.
And in my sexuality education course, one of the people that was presenting to us said, you know what, most people these days get their sex ed from a 15-year-old boy,
So
right?
most women is what you mean, get their
Most
sex ed.
women, yeah, people who sleep, right, people who are women or who sleep with women, they get their information. They are either a 15-year-old boy or they get their information. And I think that that is really the sexual, to many,
Yes.
the extent of our sexual education. And
Mm-hmm.
learning beyond that is often very difficult because women particularly blame ourselves for not having these fantastic, orgiastic,
Yes.
ecstatic experiences. We think that we are the ones that are broken, when in fact it's just that we don't have enough education to understand how we work pleasure-wise.
Sure. I thought that part of the book was really so fascinating and so universal, because really the book itself looks at not just sexual pleasure, but sexual dysfunction and pain and the certain conditions that you were facing. And I remember reading chapter upon chapter as you visited different practitioners, getting sort of angry and frustrated that you didn't really easily find many answers at the beginning. And I kind of wonder why practitioners are so ill-equipped to um, to know how women work or don't work, and we're so ill-equipped really in many cases to help you.
Yeah. Well, our doctors, our therapists, our just people.
Yeah.
And they also got their sex education, perhaps from a 15-year-old boy. and
Uh-oh.
and medical school and graduate programs in different kinds of counseling and psychology don't necessarily cover pleasure, female pleasure, not in detail. And so what you have is then you have these people who are providers who are giving us information and treating us for conditions that intersect with our pleasure, but they themselves do not have the education. In medical school, for instance, doctors might receive a day of sexuality education, and this is even doctors who specialize in conditions that might be associated with female sexuality. For instance, a general practitioner, right? Women might come in and they might have depression or low libido and different things that are going on, or they might be referred to a gynecologist for issues, and that doctor doesn't really have that information. There's a scene in my book where I go to see my gynecologist and she is absolutely uncomfortable. This is a doctor I had seen for 10 years, a wonderful practitioner, but she was so uncomfortable when I started asking specific questions about the mechanics of intercourse. She did not have that information.
It's just crazy, isn't it though? I mean, I remember that, and I remember talking to you about how little information, say, a gynecologist has on women's sexual pleasure, and that just is hard to imagine, hard to believe, but I think it's true. I can see how it's true.
I want to add there, doing this project, I have made contact now with fantastic physicians and therapists who are educating themselves or have educated themselves with regard to different kinds of sexual issues, and also generally sexuality in general, and particularly women's sexuality. So maybe when we put this up, I can add some links how people might be able to find a provider who has that specialized knowledge.
Okay, so they're out there. Maybe not a lot, but.
I think there are more and more. There are more and more physicians, for instance, who are becoming certified as sexuality educators. The organization that I'm affiliated with, the American Association of Sexuality Educators, Counselors, and Therapists, ASECT, that's the body, the association that will give me my certification. They are training not just people like me who are coming from from a writing background, but also training people who are already therapists, people who are already physicians who want to get this specialized information. So there are these organizations that are providing training and even certification, and there are more and more providers, practitioners who are looking for that specialized knowledge.
So in your case, there were a couple of conditions you had that I thought maybe we could talk about, because I think women might be able to relate, and they're interesting. There were a couple of conditions that happen in women premenopause, is what we decided to kind of split them into. And so I'm going to look, because I want to make sure that I pronounce them right. So one is vaginismus. Okay. And the other one is vestibulodena, although I'm not sure I said that correctly. So can you tell us what those are and maybe how to pronounce them too while you're at it?
Yes. So I'll start with vaginismus, which has gotten a lot more press in the last 5 years. When I started my project, I self-diagnosed myself. This really, the very beginning of my journey, I just get married, I have all these sexual difficulties, things start to deteriorate, so I found this online. And but anyway, vaginismus is overly tight and also overly weak pelvic floor muscles. Yeah, it's just tight pelvic floor muscles. And the result of having those really tight pelvic floor muscles is that with any kind of penetration, and it can even be a tampon, it feels like, for the woman, it feels like there's a wall there. It doesn't go beyond, because
Mm-hmm.
the pelvic floor muscles, they form a kind of barrier in the vagina. So it goes like that. Now,
Mm-hmm.
some people with vaginismus, there's nothing. The penis can't go in, the tampon can't go in at all. Um, Other people, they can eventually relax enough for something to penetrate. However,
Mm-hmm.
there's always pain and tightness there. And some people actually have that's called primary, where there's always been an issue. There's also something called secondary vaginismus, and that is people who've had a fine pelvic floor, but because of usually some kind of trauma, and it can be surgery or a medical procedure, the muscles just start to really
Mm-hmm.
contract. So vaginismus sounds like a very specialized thing, but I think if you really think about a woman's body and the amount of receptivity and surrender that's really necessary for penetrative sex,
Mm-hmm.
it really makes sense to me that if the body is like not, something is going on where it doesn't know how to relax, that
Mm-hmm.
it's just going to go, oh, all right, no. So that's what vaginismus is. It's just the body going, no, don't think so.
Is it just a matter of relaxing though? Because the treatment is beyond just, hey, you need to have need to have a couple glasses of wine and relax before you you try to have sex. The physical barrier is real, is what it
Yes,
sounds like.
it is. And I'm so glad you said that, because that's
Mhm.
also in my book, where I didn't know this was called vaginismus, but the first time I tried to have sex when I was 17, it took 8 months. It took until 8 months, and then by the time it happened, I was 18. Because of all that time, there was no getting past the barrier. And I did go to see a gynecologist when I was 17, at the beginning of that whole process. And she told me to have a glass of wine. And that, for many, many, many years, was the standard. And doctors still these days will sometimes give that very bad advice. But I'm so glad you brought this up, because vaginismus is an involuntary muscular
Yes.
reaction. It's
Mm-hmm.
involuntary. So you cannot relax from here. You can't even relax like taking a deep breath.
Yes.
The
Mm-hmm.
muscle is conditioned to, right, to be in this, we call it a hypertonic state, right?
Uh-huh.
Hyper, like, and tonic,
Yes.
tone, right? So it's overly, that means overly tight. The remedy, as you alluded to, the remedy is learning to relax those muscles, but it's usually usually dilators, which are, I wish I thought to bring them to show you
Yes.
what they look like. Um, they're cylinders. They're de facto different sizes of dildos, but they're not
Mm-hmm.
as interesting. They're just
They're like
cylinders.
medicinal looking a little bit.
Yeah, they're a little medicinal looking.
Yeah.
The smallest is the size of a finger.
Mm-hmm.
Often you get a package of them, or a packet, and there's usually 5, or often 5. And the largest is the size of an average erect penis, approximately 6 inches.
Mm-hmm.
And so the remedy is working with these dilators incrementally, so that the muscles themselves start to get comfortable. The muscles, not the brain, the muscles start to feel safe, relaxing.
Interesting.
But
Do
that's all vaginismus.
Sure. So vestibulodena. Now go ahead and correct my pronunciation of that, and tell me, because actually until we talked, I had never heard of that.
Yes. It's called vestibulodynia,
Okay.
and it accounts for approximately 80% in premenopausal women, 80% of painful sex. 80% of the time is because of this condition that we've never heard of.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, in my book, I call it vestibulitis because
Oh,
that's the old
yes.
name.
Yes. Okay.
I only recently learned that's how these things are changing and how the field is changing, and there's much more attention to get the terminology to fit these things better. But
Mm-hmm.
vestibulodynia means, ta-da, painful nerves,
Okay.
overactive nerves in the
Oversensitive?
oversensitive nerves.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
also, there are more nerves. The sensitivity comes because there are more nerves, but the nerves are in the vestibule. And the vestibule is an area of the vulva which is not often known, even though it's part of our own anatomy. So, the vestibule is when you go inside the inner lips, but you're not in the vagina itself. That area is called the vestibule.
Well, I mean, it's like the vestibule from your grandma's house, right? I mean, mine had, it had a little entrance at the beginning like that before you got into so it makes some sense.
It does, it does.
Yeah.
But the vestibule is not the opening to the vagina itself.
Okay.
That's what's different. It's not this opening to the vagina itself. It's the area that is inside the inner lips, but not in the vagina. So it's like a tear-shaped area that
Mm-hmm.
encompasses the urethra, is over there. At the top of it is going to be your clitoral glands or button. So from the top, the clitoral glands are button, and then there's your urethra, and then
Mm-hmm.
there's your vagina at the bottom. And that whole area is called the vestibule.
Okay.
Yeah. And that area in some people, and some people think that it's a congenital condition, but some people have overactive nerves. Now, one practitioner who acted as a consultant for my book, her name is Rachel Rubin, MD, and she's amazing.
Yeah.
And Rachel and I actually, she came and I do these things called sex brunches, which
Mm-hmm.
are
Yes.
which are information sessions.
Sounds fun. Yeah.
Yes, they're great. I wish you'd been in DC. I did a couple for Wolfers, and
Oh,
yeah, in the
next.
lobby of my building. They're fabulous. And Rachel did a famous one that's famous with the Wolfers here in my DC
Cool.
area. She's amazing. And so Rachel, I went to see Rachel only recently as a patient after starting this collaboration with her. And Rachel said the whole time she was reading my book, she was diagnosing me.
Yes.
Because she knew I had what I was calling vestibulitis, but which is now
Mm-hmm.
called vestibulodynia.
Mm-hmm.
But Rachel, at the beginning of my consult, she said, "Let me ask you one question. Do you like people touching your belly button?" I said, "What? What a strange question."
Well, not many people do.
Well, I said,
Oh,
"No,
oh, so
I
you knew you
hate it.
didn't like it.
I
Mm.
hate it.
Mm.
I despise it. I find
Yes.
it, I literally get nauseated when somebody does that."
Interesting.
And she said that is the same kind of tissue, and that she's doing research around this, that there is a correlation that she's found between this kind of sensitivity
Mm-hmm.
and these overactive nerves in the vestibule.
Yes.
The same tissue also is around the G spot inside the vagina,
Yes.
around the urethra.
Mm-hmm.
Has a sponge. It's basically a spongy tissue around it, so it's technically called the urethral sponge. And it's not just the underside, which is that G-spot area, but all around. And people who have vestibulodynia sometimes have that same sensitivity around the G-spot area. That's me too.
Yes. Interesting.
So that G-spot extra fantastic pleasure is not great, doesn't work for us because we've got that nerve sensitivity.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, that's what vestibulodynia is. It's just a fancy word for oversensitive nerves in the vestibule and possibly these other areas.
So we talked about too, and as you visited practitioners and you got sort of one diagnosis possibly and then the other, another thing that was brought up is something that happens to women postmenopause, and that is the word vaginal atrophy, which, like if you say them to, no one wants to hear, but is quite common. Can you talk about that as a source of would you call it sexual dysfunction or pain or both?
Yeah. So vaginal atrophy is another of these terminologies that's going through an evolution.
Mm.
6 years ago, about 6 years ago, the medical community, because of a certain amount of pressure from these fabulous organizations, including the North American Menopause Society, they decided that that vaginal atrophy is really needs an umbrella term, because vaginal atrophy is, let me just define it and then I'll talk about what that umbrella term is. So vaginal atrophy are vaginal changes that happen in the vagina because of menopause, because of a lack of hormones, and primarily, but not only estrogen.
Mm-hmm.
And typical or very common reactions that people have when they have atrophy, and not everyone has atrophy, are pain because of dryness and because of narrowing of the vagina, and
Mm-hmm.
because the tissues become thinner,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so many women, many women, and I think Nina started this group, we're having these questions about
Exactly.
what the hell is going on with our vaginas, and can we please
Yes.
talk about it? So many women have these problems and are blindsided because we're told very vaguely, right, Robin? Like, oh yeah, you're gonna shrivel up, but we don't really get
Yeah,
the specifics of this.
really pretty, very vaguely, if at all.
Right.
And when you and I have talked, you've said that really it's beyond vaginal dryness. It's basically it's your genitals, your urethra. It's a change because of changing hormones in all of that, and all of that can create issues.
Exactly. And I want to read you some of the symptoms
Yep.
of what this umbrella term is. So the umbrella term is known as genitourinary, one word, genitourinary syndrome of menopause, otherwise
Mm-hmm.
known as GSM. So
Yes.
GSM is the new terminology, and GSM is really comprehensive. And it's a really interesting shift away from the vaginal atrophy as
Mm.
diagnosis, because it allows doctors to hopefully ask women about what's going on, because and for women to understand different things that might be going on, so that they can then seek treatment or make different kinds of changes. So I'm going to read you what GSM is. So, or what the symptoms are. Symptoms include decreased lubrication, increased propensity for bacterial and yeast infections, painful intercourse, narrowing and shortening of the vagina, loss of inner lips, labia minora, thinning of vaginal tissue, burning inside the canal, soreness at the vaginal opening in the vestibule, inflammation of tissue surrounding the urethra, that whole G-spot area, vaginismus, inflammation of tissue surrounding the urethra, pelvic pain, inflammation of vulvar tissue, which is called vaginitis, and bleeding during sex. So those are not all the, the things that can go wrong, but that's I think a bulk of it.
And I think you're
So
right that over the years, reading posts from Wolfers, I've seen questions about all those things from women asking, what the heck is going on? Is this part of something? or should I seek help for this, and what would it be? And sort of piecing it all together, and knowing even that all of those things happen maybe in conjunction with one another as part of menopause.
Yeah, and I want to talk a little bit, sorry, about my own issues, because
Yeah.
just as an example of how these work together, and how it's really critical to get a very, very good doctor who can diagnose and parse these out, because the remedies are different, and
Mm-hmm.
choices that we make need to be informed. I believe really need to be informed by a full understanding of what the heck is going on. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
so I had vaginismus, as I talked about the first time I tried to have sex. It was completely undiagnosed, and it was also associated with trauma. I had been sexually abused as a child, so I understood I had something wrong with me, but I just thought I was broken. That's a whole other component part, right? The psychological aspect of this.
Mm-hmm.
But physically, I had those hypertonic muscles that were a barrier, and then I forced them or conditioned them to relax a little. But I had painful sex always for 30 years.
Mm-hmm.
Then once I started, and I had a little bit of burning. So probably this congenital vestibulodynia.
Yep.
Once I hit menopause, the burning started to get worse. That's what I noticed most
Ah.
originally. But
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know I had vestibulodynia. So I
Right.
noticed burning, and the vaginismus got worse because the body just seizes up. It's just a
It's
natural response. It
yes.
was I was having more pain. Pain was normal for me, but I started having more pain. So the body went,
Mm-hmm.
what? So the
Mm-hmm.
muscle got tighter. And also now, as I got closer and closer and then into menopause, I started having the dryness and the thinning of the tissues, and also, more infections. So all of these things were started to get layered on top of each other. But the vaginismus, that muscle, those muscle contractions, or it's really like a spasm because of the tight and weak muscles, um, that often kicks into gear even if somebody never had it in menopause, because the body's now having pain vaginally, so the muscles
Interesting.
start to seize,
Mm-hmm.
and then that becomes a whole other issue that needs to be like separated out to see, okay, are these muscles now conditioned only to be in lockdown, and do we need a separate remedy that might just be relaxing those muscles?
So you're saying that vaginismus can also be a result of menopause, and it could
Yes,
come late. It could come later for somebody. It doesn't have to be a lifelong
that's
issue.
yes,
Mm-hmm.
that's that's called secondary vaginismus. And
Ah.
but not many people, except for some extraordinary doctors like Rachel Rubin and
Mm-hmm.
other doctors who are practicing something called sexual medicine, and
Yeah.
doctors who have who have acquired now this very extensive sexual education on top of their medical education. It's not that many doctors who make that connection necessarily, that to know that you may come in and say, okay, I'm having pain now with intercourse, and they'll give you estrogen, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
That's typical these days, but they're not necessarily trying to figure out, are you also having overly tight muscles now, because for uh, 11 months you've been grinning and bearing painful
Yes.
sex. Now the
Mm-hmm.
muscles don't know how to relax, and so you may take the estrogen, but the muscles still may be tight, and so you're figuring out, well, why, or you're wondering, why am I still having painful sex now? So we
Mm-hmm.
really need to understand all of these conditions, in order to get a great picture of what's going on in our bodies, and then to seek remedies.
Okay, so this is sort of how I felt when I was reading your book, which was, wow, there's this, then there's this, and then she's got this, and then and I was so wanting you to find what you needed and find help. And so can you tell us which of all the practitioners you went to, where did you find help, and who were those? What kind of people were those?
Yeah, thank you. Great question. So my book, the whole structure of my book is me going to visit all of these different practitioners. And so I see 15 different kinds of practitioners. So not
Yep.
15, but 15 different kinds.
Yep.
And I tried 30 different healing, or you can say pleasure enhancing methods.
Mm-hmm.
It's quite the journey.
It is.
And
It is.
so
It's amazing that you stuck with it for as long as you did. Yes.
I want to have great sex. I thought, gee whiz, can't
Yes.
have great sex.
Yep. You had a good
All right.
goal.
So here's what worked the best. What worked the best was two things. One, getting a great diagnosis,
Mm-hmm.
finding out what was going on.
Yes.
That's primary.
Yes.
Then, in addition to that, what worked for me was finding these amazing women. So there's people of all genders who are doing fantastic sex ed. But for
Mm-hmm.
me, I happened to find these women, and they were mostly postmenopausal women. I call them goddess crones.
Yes. Yes. Uh-huh.
And they are these women passing on sex education, teaching other women about pleasure. So as an example, I have a private session with a tantrika, a 72-year-old tantrika. I go to see her basically for a private lesson in my body.